Well, Barry was right. By the time you get to this point in the story, things look a little grim. But the good news is, our God is a God with a plan to love human beings right back into paradise. Now, after the first humans opened the door to sin and walked away from God, God has been pursuing us, wooing us, calling us back home, for great is God's faithfulness. Now, God used the prophets to call the people back home. Jeremiah's career took place over some of the nation's greatest and lowest moments in its history. He faithfully served the Lord from the time of King Josiah until the fall of Jerusalem. And in his lifetime, Jeremiah witnessed his people going from faithfulness and obedience to infidelity, idolatry, and hypocrisy. God gave Jeremiah the heavy burden of announcing judgment upon Judah and Jerusalem. But remember, judgment is never the last word in God's love story with the people. Jeremiah also had the privilege of proclaiming God's intention to build and to plant again if the people return to God. Great is God's faithfulness. Now, in Jeremiah's call story, we learn about the prophet. God knew Jeremiah before Jeremiah was even conceived. And the word knew here is very important. The word knew implies that God knew, watched over, and cared for Jeremiah as well as understood his character. It's that kind of knowing. From the beginning, God was there. While Jeremiah was still in the womb, God consecrated him. Now, priests were consecrated to do God's holy work in the sanctuary. They were set apart to be in that place doing God's work. But here, God consecrated Jeremiah, set him apart to proclaim God's holiness and the demands of holiness among the people in the streets, not in that sanctuary, away from them. Well, through Jeremiah, God continued to woo and pursue a reluctant Israel to come back because great is God's faithfulness. Now, Jeremiah had objections to God's call. He was too young. He didn't have the words to speak for God. He was afraid. And let's face it, who wouldn't be afraid? You know what happens to prophets. They face terrible hardship, rejection of their message, persecution, even death. But God reassured Jeremiah that age was not a barrier, the words would come from God, and that God would be with him to deliver him, because great is God's faithfulness. God did not promise Jeremiah an easy life. What God promised was that the great story of love and salvation was not over. God still loved the faithless Israel and sought to bring the people back home, but also sought through Jeremiah to bring other nations to him. Once again, God sought to fulfill that promise made to Abraham that through his descendants, all the families of earth would know God's blessing. For great is God's faithfulness. Now, by the world's standards, Jeremiah failed in his mission. His people rejected him. The prophecies of destruction were fulfilled. Jerusalem fell. The exile began, and the prophet wept. But the prophet's tears were not hopeless. Jeremiah, despite everything, that God was with them. The prophet said, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. For the Lord does not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone." God's now calling you to play your part in the story of love and salvation. God has known you and loved you since before you were born. And now God is calling you to live out your faith among the people, We do not limit God's holiness to what happens within these walls. God calls us to proclaim God's holiness and the demands of holiness and holy living out in the streets among the people. That is where we are to be. Now, before you raise objections and say you cannot possibly do this, remember Jeremiah. He was young, inarticulate, and fearful. He knew that he was inadequate to the task, and he was right. Apart from God, he could not do this. He could not be a prophet on his own. But God didn't ask him to do it alone. God provided Jeremiah exactly what he needed, the words to speak and the courage to go forth. For great is God's faithfulness. And God is as great and faithful now as in the days of Jeremiah. When God calls us, God will provide us everything that we need to remain faithful, even if we're not successful by the world's standards. For despite seeming failure, Jeremiah remained faithful to his call and has blessed the generations ever since. Every generation that has followed has been blessed by Jeremiah's faithfulness. And as with Jeremiah, God is with us, and God will provide for us what we need to fulfill our callings. Our God is truly with us, and our God is for us. The Father sent the Son into the world that we would experience God's presence among us. Jesus is the one who revealed to us that God is one whose judgment is tempered by grace and mercy. Through his life and his ministry, we glimpse the life for which we were created as Jesus showed us how to live in love and fellowship with God and with each other. Jesus showed us what it looks like to be truly human, human in the way God intended. And through his death and his resurrection, Jesus proved to us the lengths to which God was willing to go to bring us back home, that we might have life and life eternal, to bring us with God. Great is God's faithfulness. Now, before ascending into heaven, Jesus placed a call upon his followers' lives. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And as with Jeremiah, God did not call without providing the way. Jesus' call upon us comes with the promise, I am with you always. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Through the power of the Holy Spirit at work within us and among us, we are able to fulfill our call to discipleship. Now, he was a seminary student. And if you know anything about seminary students, they get a little full of themselves. They think they know everything. Well, he knew that Albert Schweitzer was wrong. His theology was suspect. He had read, the seminarian had read the historical Christ, or the historical Jesus. What a disaster it was theologically. He knew that Schweitzer was a liberal. So he was determined to go and confront the great man when he found out that he was in Cleveland giving a concert. He boarded a bus with questions in hand, how he was going to challenge the great man. Well, the 75-year-old master organist, medical doctor, philosopher, biblical scholar, lecturer, and writer played a wonderful concert there at that church in Cleveland. And then he went to the church hall for a reception. Approaching Schweitzer with questions in hand, he overheard Schweitzer saying, "You've been very warm and hospitable to me, and I thank you for it. I wish I could stay longer here among you, but I must go back to Africa. I must go back to Africa because my people are poor and diseased and hungry and dying, and I have to go. We have a medical station there in Lamborghini. if there's anyone here in this room who has the love of Jesus, would you be prompted by that love to go with me and help me? He looked down at his questions and he realized that they were stupid. Answering Jesus' call does not mean arguing minor points of theology in the face of great need. It means loving others as God has loved you through Christ. Fred Craddock went on to be named one of the greatest preachers in the English-speaking world, telling stories about the world-changing, life-changing love of Jesus Christ. When God called this young man to be a minister, God provided him exactly what he needed to be a faithful, devoted, passionate follower of Christ instead of a pompous preacher. For great is God's faithfulness. But God is faithful to more than those called to ordained ministry. God is faithful to the ministries of all of God's people. The day after they buried her son, she knew that she would never get out of bed again. There was no need to, no reason to. Her friends and her family urged her to eat, to bathe, to dress, but she knew there was no reason. There was no reason to do this. For a week, she lay in bed, and then she heard the words, "I know." That was all. But in that moment, she knew that the Father understood her pain at losing her son. She was able to get out of bed, take a shower, get dressed, and go downstairs to her husband and other children. God had called her to a ministry of being wife and mother, and she knew that God was with her and God was for her in the midst of her pain. Her pain did not suddenly disappear. It did not suddenly get easy. But knowing that God understood and that God was with her made it possible. And about a year later, she found herself at a clothing ministry where she was able to speak to people who were facing their own desperate challenges and offer them hope, the same hope she had received from God. She was able to help them along in their faith journey. God provided my friend Audrey with exactly what she needed to be a faithful disciple of Christ, and then provided her with the opportunities to share that faith, to help others along in their own journey, because great is God's faithfulness.